So this morning we're going to be turning to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. We're going to pick up reading where we left off last week with the miracle of the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac. We're going to pick it up at verse 21 now, Mark 5, verse 21. We've got a bit of a double account or a double story this morning. Kind of interesting how Mark writes it. It's on page 1559 in most of your pew Bibles, if you'd like to follow along on paper. Otherwise, words will be on the screen as well. Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21, and we will read through verse 43 to the end of the chapter. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went into where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In our passage this morning, as I mentioned, Mark is giving us a story within a story, and it's very interesting to me and fun to think about why he would have done this, why he would have kind of embedded the story about the bleeding woman into this larger story about Jairus and his daughter who is on death's door. And so that's kind of what I was thinking about this week, the relationship between these two stories. And I don't think there's any doubt that these two stories are related and that they both together teach us a few things about faith, okay? 3 things, actually. This is what I came up with. Sometimes Jesus seems to disregard our faith. And secondly, Jesus is always working to grow our faith. And third, Jesus will regularly test our faith, okay? So those are the 3 things. Sometimes Jesus seems to disregard our faith. Jesus is always working to grow our faith. And Jesus will regularly test our faith. And so Let's look at each one of those three kind of in turn. The first thing I want to point out is that Jesus will sometimes disregard our faith, and this is kind of the uncomfortable, and this is the one that we look at and we think kind of, oh man, why would Jesus do that? That seems strange. And so I'll just say that Jesus will sometimes disregard our faith. At least that's how it seems from our perspective, okay? So that's a little bit different. Our perspective is a little bit different than reality. And so we have Jairus, and Jairus is a synagogue ruler in a place called Capernaum, okay? Actually, the ruins are still there. Archaeologists tell us that the floor mosaics that are found in the ruins of this synagogue actually go back to Jairus and Jesus' day, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. Jairus was apparently one of the people who had contributed money initially for the construction of the synagogue. And he, our text tells us, was the chief of the synagogue. He was kind of the man in charge. And so he would decide things like what part of the scripture and what scroll we were going to read from on a given Sabbath day in a given service. And he would decide who it was that got to read from the scrolls and preach the Torah. And so Jairus was a very, very public figure in his day and in his time. And he was very well known in Capernaum. Well, in our text, we read that Jairus' daughter fell gravely ill. She's 12 years old. We read that kind of toward the end of our passage. But when we first are introduced to the situation, kind of the tension in the story, we realize that this is a girl who is inevitably going to die within minutes, within an hour at most, perhaps, if you want to raise the tension even higher. And so, needless to say, there is this measure of urgency that's introduced here very, very early on in the text. And I would argue, just kind of as an aside, that Jairus, at this point in Jesus' ministry, shows a great measure of courage himself as the head of the Jewish synagogue there in coming to Jesus, because we have kind of read over in some of the previous chapters that Jesus already is leaving a bad taste in the mouths of many of the religious leaders of that time, kind of crossing some boundaries with regard to what they thought were proper Sabbath behaviors and that sort of thing, causing a ruckus in their minds and causing people to be distracted from what it was that they were teaching them. And so Jairus shows a great deal of courage in coming to Jesus. And the scripture says that Jairus came to Jesus and fell at his feet. He fell at his feet. So he came to Jesus and, somebody just tanked it there. That's okay. Usually I don't get distracted by that. Looked like it hurt. Anyway, Jairus comes and falls at Jesus' feet, okay? And that shows us that he had some measure of faith already. He had faith that Jesus could do something. He had faith that Jesus could heal his daughter. Verse 22b and 23, seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so I want you to notice, I point this out from time to time, especially in this series, when we're talking about the miracles of Jesus, it's not an issue of can you, right? It's not an issue of can you do this? Can you do this? It's an issue of will you do this? Can you do this is, I'm a little bit skeptical. I don't really have faith that you're even able to do this. Will you do this is, I have faith that you can do this if it is your will and the will of your Father in heaven. So I am putting it in your lap. Anyway, Jairus says, "Jesus, will you come? Jesus, will you please come?" There was desperation in his words, and Jesus leaves immediately. And I think this is a wonderful thing. These are little things that ordinarily we just read over, but Jesus immediately goes with Jairus. Jairus comes to him with a request, with desperation in his voice, and Jesus immediately goes with him. And so they're out on the street now. in the streets of Capernaum, and they're heading toward Jairus' house. And there's a large crowd following them, and they're pushing and they're shoving, and they're wanting to kind of get up front. They don't want to miss anything that Jesus possibly says. They don't want to miss anything that Jesus possibly does. And so Jesus, no doubt, is walking quickly, and Jairus is a little ways ahead, moving probably even more quickly, looking back from time to time and urging Jesus on, like, come on, let's go. We have no time to lose. And then suddenly, Jairus is going, and he looks back, and he realizes that Jesus isn't there. It's not there. Jairus looks back, and to his great frustration, he scans the crowd, and he sees that Jesus has stopped and is talking to this woman. He hears Jesus ask, "Who touched me?" And you can imagine Jairus, like his mind racing in 100 different directions. I mean, he cannot believe that Jesus was so insensitive, so inconsiderate to him, the mission that they were on, that he would stop and talk to someone when he knows the urgency here. I told him, my daughter's about to die. She is on death's door. He was coming with me. This was great. This was all going the way it was supposed to. And now all of a sudden, it's like Jesus got distracted. Well, just then, Jairus maybe sees these people coming from a distance, but he sees some people that he recognizes from his household coming to give him something of a report. They approach him and say, "Jairus, we're sorry. We're sorry, but your daughter is dead. It's too late." And I mean, you can imagine, just like I can, what is Jairus thinking when they tell him this? He's thinking, man, if only Jesus had not stopped. If only we had kept going. If only it wasn't for this infernal crowd, we could have gotten there in time to do something, in time to save her. Does Jesus even care? And so it seems that Jesus disregarded this man's faith. It seems that Jesus disregarded that man's faith. At least that's how it looks. You remember from a couple weeks ago, the disciples in the boat waking Jesus up as he was just cashed out in the middle of this terrible storm? They wake him up and they say, "Lord, don't you care that we're about to die? Jesus, don't you care?" Well, we've all been there. I would say Jesus cared enough to go with Jairus in the first place. I mean, we read he set off immediately in the direction of Jairus' house. But then something came up. He stopped. He stopped and ignored Jairus and completely ignored the urgency of the situation. At least that's how it seems, and that's how it would have seemed to Jairus. And I wonder, because I've been there at times, I wonder maybe if some of you are there today, in a place in life, in a situation that really has kind of gone off the rails and gotten out of control, and it seems as though Jesus is ignoring you. It seems as though Jesus has forgotten about you. And you're a person of faith. I know most of you. I know most of you people of strong faith. Are you going through something and it just seems like Jesus has totally disregarded that faith? He's totally ignoring you, totally forgot about you. You had some hopes and aspirations, and maybe you even had some indication that Jesus was actually going to do something in answer to your prayers. Maybe you had a glimmer of hope, and maybe that glimmer of hope didn't really pan out the way you thought. Well, maybe it seemed like he was there, and then all of a sudden it seemed like it wasn't. He wasn't. Maybe it seemed like he was in the process of doing something, and then he stopped. And now you're angry, and now you're kind of cynical. You feel as though maybe you were foolish to trust in him in the first place. And you know, the fact is that Jesus will sometimes seem to disregard your faith. So I'm going to leave us hanging there, and we're going to move on to the second thing, okay? The second thing I want to point out is that Jesus will certainly grow your faith, and that sounds a bit more positive. Sounds a bit more positive. That's kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. That's something that maybe we can grasp onto and get a little hope from, right? This is an important lesson about suffering. I'm going to tell you right now an important lesson about suffering, that the providence of God is always instructive, okay? The providence of God is always instructive, which means that there is a purpose to what God is doing or what God is not doing, okay? There's always a purpose. News comes from Jairus' house that his daughter had died. And the friends who came to tell him the news are now trying to comfort him, and they're saying, okay, we know you're taking this hard. Let's try not to make a scene out here. Let's just get you home. Let's get you home and get you kind of settled into the grieving process here. And here's how Jesus responds to the news. Verse 36, ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, don't be afraid, just believe. He ignores what's just been said. When friends come to tell Jairus that his daughter is dead, Jesus just ignores it. He doesn't offer any sympathy. He doesn't give Jairus a hug and say, hey, buddy, I'm here for you. Jesus looks directly at Jairus and says, don't be afraid, just believe. Now, Jairus, we already talked about this. Jairus already believes, right? Jairus already believes. Of course, that's why he came to Jesus in the first place. But Jesus has a bigger plan. Jesus has some bigger things going on in his mind, and what he's trying to do, he wants to grow this man's faith. He wants to grow Jairus' faith. Because see, it's one thing to believe that Jesus can heal somebody, but it's a step up to believe that Jesus can actually raise somebody from the dead, okay? There's a little bit of difference there. It's one thing to believe that Jesus can heal somebody. It's another thing that he can actually raise them from the dead. Undo what had been done, right? And so Jesus says to Jairus, just believe. Commit yourself to me. Commit yourself to me now. Trust me. I know what I'm doing. Which is why this story about the woman bleeding for 12 years is here, I think, right in the middle of this story about Jairus and his daughter. What did the woman do? She believed, right? She too believed. She had faith. She reached out and touched Jesus. And I can't tell you exactly what her issue was, but, my mom, when we were younger, she would have kind of just categorized it in that little box called woman problems, right? We'll leave it at that. But it was certainly an issue. I need you to understand this. It was certainly an issue that under Jewish law would render a woman unclean, okay? And that was going to cause all kinds of problems. That's a life changer right there. Leviticus 15 talks about the implications of what a woman dealing with this would have to undergo. She had lived a heartbreaking life for the past 12 years, socially an outcast. Anyone who came into contact with her would be considered immediately unclean, okay? And she had likely tried every imaginable solution to this problem. Now, the Talmud, which is an extensive Jewish commentary on the law and on the prophets of the Old Testament, actually lists 11 potential cures for this issue of perpetual bleeding. One says, I'm going to read this carefully because in case any of you need to go home and do this. One says that you were to take gum and resin of crocus, crush it up all together with some wine and drink it, okay? If that failed, a person was to take some onions, boil them in some wine, and they were to give it to the ailing woman to drink and say, arise from thy flux, okay? If that failed, this is my favorite one. The woman was supposed to go to a place where two ways meet, so like an intersection, okay? And she was to hold a glass of wine in her right hand. And then somebody was supposed to come up behind her and go, wah! And scare her and then say, arise from thy flux. I could not believe that, reading that. Maybe that worked for somebody. Either way, very likely, and this is getting back serious, very likely this woman with this serious problem had tried absolutely everything she could possibly think of. Because as I said, this was a life changer. This would have forced her to live in complete isolation. She couldn't be around people. She couldn't be around her family. She couldn't develop relationships, because to be around her was to make yourself unclean. And so she had probably tried everything, no matter how peculiar. But finally, this opportunity came that she was able to approach Jesus. Jesus was in the area. She'd heard the whisperings about Jesus and what he could do. And so she went to Jesus. Notice this. She went to Jesus anonymously. I mean, she wanted to be just another face in the crowd, because you know what? She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to be in this crowd. She wasn't supposed to be around other people. And so she probably had a hood up over her head. She was probably just sneaking around, just hoping that somebody wouldn't catch her and punish her for being somewhere where she shouldn't have been. And her plan was that when Jesus passed, she was going to reach out and just touch his garment, just touch his robe that he was wearing, hoping desperately not to be noticed, hoping desperately that just touching his robe would be enough. And verse 29 tells us, immediately after she did that, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering, 12 years of suffering. And she felt free from it. I know some of you suffer from different things. Some of them are emotional things. Some of them are physical things. I mean, can you imagine the feeling in your body that you just know that all of a sudden that issue has left you? I can't imagine what that feels like. I'm assuming that that's what it's going to feel like to enter into glory and be with Jesus, that there's just going to be this huge change in how we feel about ourselves physically and mentally, and the veil will be lifted. But anyway, I don't want to get too far off. But immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt completely healed. And here's where her plan went wrong. All of a sudden, Jesus stopped, because Jesus sensed that power had gone out of him. Now, I can't explain that. I could try. I mean, I don't know how Jesus knew that his cloak had been touched, but Scripture testifies to the fact that he felt it, that something had gone out of him, and Jesus stopped and chose to address the situation that his Father in heaven had placed right before him. Meanwhile, Jesus kept Jairus waiting. Jesus kept Jairus waiting long enough for his daughter to breathe her last. Perhaps Jairus, too, needed to bear witness to Jesus' interaction with this woman. Because remember, Jesus is teaching Jairus a lesson about faith. It was as though Jesus was saying through his actions, through his behavior, I know that you're distracted and anxious, Jairus. But look at this poor woman. Everyone despises her. No one wants to be near her. And she knows that I can heal her. Yeah, her faith is uninformed, it's bordering on superstitious, and that's why I had to stop, and that's why I had to draw her out, because I couldn't let her go on from this moment healed, but then thinking months or years later that there was something magical or superstitious in my garments. No, she needed to understand that it is faith in the person of Jesus that saves. And that, I think, is why Jesus, with regard to her, stops and instructs her. It was her faith that led to her salvation. It was a tiny faith, but it was faith. And that said, by God's grace, even a weak faith can lay hold of a strong Christ. And the promises of God, just so you know, they're not addressed to those who are mighty in faith, only to those who have real faith, even if that faith is as small as a mustard seed. Whoever believes in Jesus Christ shall not perish, but have eternal life. I mean, if your faith is only as strong as a bruised reed, like it talks about in Isaiah, be assured that the Lord will not break it. And so that's the second thing. Jesus is always working toward growing the faith of his people. Which brings us to the third and last point I want to make, is that Jesus will regularly test your faith. And I think that he was testing Jairus here. In fact, the doctrine of God's sovereignty, I think, reinforces the fact that this whole thing about Jairus being forced to wait is a test. Well, Jesus gets to the house, and already the professional wailers are there. Or maybe these were genuine wailers. Maybe these were close family members. But he tells the crowd in the street to stay where they were. And he tells the people who were in the house to, hey, go outside. I got some work to do here. Only James and Peter and John and the parents were allowed inside with Jesus. Before he goes in, Jesus does something really, really puzzling to me. He says to the crowd outside, she's not dead, she's only sleeping. Now, why did Jesus say that if the girl was dead? I mean, do you understand the problem that creates? Because imagine the talk of the town that evening. People in Capernaum arguing about whether or not the girl was actually dead. Some claiming that a miracle had taken place, others claiming that all this talk about Jesus raising the dead was nonsense. Why did Jesus allow, and if you want to go even further, why did he even create such confusion? I mean, if it were me, I would have suggested, hey, let's bring this girl out into the street. Let's have the crowd watch as some kind of medical professional checks the girl out and listens to her heart and listens to her breathing, shine a light into her eyes, make sure very, very publicly that she was truly dead, right? Then in a very dramatic way, Jesus could have preached a sermon about how he was the Messiah and that he could raise the dead, and then boom, he would raise the dead girl right in front of everybody. Why wouldn't Jesus do that? I would have done that. If God gave me the gift of raising people from the dead, I would want people to see it, right? So why does Jesus keep the people outside? And why does he sow this little seed of doubt in people's minds that this girl was just sleeping? The only reason I can see is that for the rest of Jairus' life, this event was going to be attached to him, right? Whenever he walked down the street from that time forward, people were going to say, oh, there goes Jairus, who thinks that Jesus raised his daughter from the dead, but actually she was just sleeping. And understand how this would test Jairus for years to come. That his faith would be rooted and grounded in the person of Jesus Christ, no matter what people said behind his back, no matter what accusations they would make about what actually happened during this event. He would recall how Jesus had uttered those words, Talitha cum, arise little girl, and a dead girl had come back to life. Just a word. Just a sovereign word from Jesus, and the little girl got up, and the disciples and the parents were amazed. They were totally and completely amazed. And then Jesus said, you better get her something to eat. Awesome. It reminds me of what John says in Revelation 1, verse 17 and 18. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and Hades. Andrew Bonner writes, if Jesus holds the keys to death and Hades, the first thing when I walk through that door is Jesus. And that is perhaps why this story is here. To encourage us, to bring faith and joy and hope into our hearts, to give us courage and to bolster our souls. When we one day pass on from this life into the glory of the next, the first person that we're going to see is Jesus. The first voice that we're going to hear is that of Jesus. The first hand that we will hold will be that of Jesus. The sovereign, omnipotent, powerful Lord Jesus Christ, who sometimes chooses to disregard our faith, at least in our own minds, who always works to grow our faith, and who often tests our faith in order one day to make that faith perfect. Amen. Let's come to God in prayer.